What evidence is there for the empty tomb?
In my book, I lay out about 10 lines of evidence for the empty tomb, so I couldn't possibly hope to summarize it all here. Let me just mention a couple of points. One of the most important facts, I think, undergirding the empty tomb is, oddly enough, the burial story of Jesus. If the burial story of Jesus is accurate, then that means that the site of Jesus' tomb was known to both Jew and Christian alike in Jerusalem. But if that is the case, then it seems to me that the inference that the tomb was found empty is very near at hand. For if the burial site of Jesus were known, then it would have been impossible for the disciples to believe in the resurrection of Jesus and proclaim this in Jerusalem when Jesus' corpse still lay in the tomb. If Christianity or the resurrection was preached in Jerusalem itself, as it was, the very city where Jesus was publicly executed, where his grave remained and was publicly known, the disciples could not possibly have believed that he was risen from the dead in the face of a closed tomb. And even if they had, scarcely anybody else would have believed in them if they proclaimed anything so silly. For a first century Jew, the idea that you could have a spiritual resurrection while the corpse still lay on the tomb was simply unknown. That is an invention of 20th century theology, not first century Judaism. And in any case, the Jewish authorities certainly could have made an end to the whole affair by simply pointing to the closed tomb of Jesus and said, look, the grave is occupied, he is not risen from the dead, and that would have been the end of it. And therefore, the accuracy of the burial story, I think, provides powerful grounds for affirming the historicity of the empty tomb account. And unfortunately, for those who wish to deny the empty tomb, the burial of Jesus is widely recognized to be one of the most historically credible facts that we have about the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth. So that those who deny the empty tomb are also forced to deny the burial story, which is a desperate expedient since it is so historically well attested. So that would just be one aspect. Another aspect of the empty tomb narrative itself, as it's found in the Gospel of Mark, is that this portion of the narrative was probably part of Mark's early source material that he used for describing the passion and the death of Jesus, the last week of Jesus' life and his crucifixion. The burial story marked the close of the passion of Jesus as he is laid in the tomb and the stone is rolled across its entrance. And the empty tomb story was probably part of that passion story because that story would not have been circulated without victory at its end. Without the empty tomb, the passion story is incomplete. Also, the empty tomb story is connected to the burial account by syntactical and linguistic ties. For example, the pronouns used in the empty tomb story have their antecedents in the burial story, so that it's really one smooth account. Now, when you remember that Mark is the earliest of our Gospels, that means that his source material was even older. And this passion narrative that included the empty tomb story could have gone back to within the AD 30s even. Remember, Jesus was crucified about AD 30. So that we're talking about a source that is extremely old and is therefore a valuable source of historical information. Also, the empty tomb story itself, thirdly, is extremely simple and lacks any signs of legendary development. I think the best way to appreciate this would be to compare it to accounts of the empty tomb that are found in apocryphal Gospels, that is, forgeries dating from the 2nd century, such as the so-called Gospel of Peter. In the Gospel of Peter, the narrative describes the resurrection of Jesus itself coming out of the tomb. The narrative proceeds by saying that during the night, there is a loud voice that rings out from heaven, and then the stone across the entrance to the tomb rolls back by itself. Then 2 men are seen coming out of heaven and going into the tomb. Then 3 men come out of the tomb, 2 of them holding up the 3rd man. The heads of the 2 men stretch up to the clouds, but the head of the 3rd man overpasses the clouds. Then a cross comes out of the tomb, and a voice from heaven asks, "Hast thou preached to them that sleep?" And the cross answers, yay. Now, these are how real legends look. You see, they're colored by all sorts of theological and apologetical motifs. And these are noticeably lacking from the Mark and empty tomb account, which seems to be basically a straightforward report of what actually happened. If I might just mention a couple of other points that I think are significant. The empty tomb was probably discovered by women. And I think that this is evident when you contemplate two aspects of the role of women in first century Jewish society. First of all, women occupied, quite frankly, a low rung on the Jewish social ladder. They were second-class citizens in first century Palestine. This is evident from such Jewish rabbinical sayings as the following: "Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women." Or again, "Woe to him whose children are female, but blessings on him whose children are male." Women were not as highly regarded as males in that society. Secondly, the witness of women was regarded as so worthless that they were not even allowed to serve as witnesses in a legal court of law. If a man were seen committing a crime by a group of women, he could not be convicted on the basis of their testimony because their witness was thought to be so unreliable that it wouldn't even be admitted into court. Now, in light of those two facts, how remarkable must it be that the empty tomb story describes the discovery of the empty tomb by women? The fact that it is women rather than men who discover Jesus' tomb empty suggests that this is a historically credible account. Any later legend would have certainly made the male disciples to discover the empty tomb, Peter and John, for example. The fact that it is women that discovered the empty tomb, women whose witness was worthless and counted for nothing, is best explained by the fact that, like it or not, they were the ones who found the empty tomb, and the Gospels faithfully record this fact. One final piece of evidence that might be mentioned would be the fact that the earliest Jewish polemic or anti-Christian propaganda itself presupposes the empty tomb. The earliest Jewish polemic that was launched against the Christian proclamation, "He is risen from the dead," was to state that the disciples came by night and stole away his body. And then the Christians responded to that there was a guard at the tomb and they would have prevented the theft, and so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing in this dispute is not the historicity of the presence of the guard. Rather, the interesting thing is what the Jewish polemic was saying in response to the Christian proclamation, "He is risen from the dead." Were they saying, these men are drunk with new wine, or his tomb is still out there on the hillside? No, they were saying the disciples came and stole away his body. Now think about that for a minute. What that implies is that the body was missing. The earliest Jewish polemic was itself an attempt to explain away the empty tomb. And thus we have evidence for the empty tomb, which comes not from the Christians, but from the very enemies of the earliest Christians themselves, which is historical evidence of first-rate quality, because it comes not from the sources which believed in the resurrection, but from those which disputed it. So on the basis of reasons like this, and many others, the majority of New Testament critics today affirm the historicity of the empty tomb story.
Three reasons why we can be confident that Jesus' tomb was empty. First is the Jerusalem factor. Jesus was publicly executed and buried in Jerusalem, and then his resurrection was proclaimed there publicly. So it would have been impossible for Christianity to get off the ground in Jerusalem if his body was still in the tomb. The Roman and Jewish authorities would have only had to visit the tomb and view the corpse, and the misunderstanding was over. There is no evidence that this occurred. In fact, the response of the Jewish leadership was quite different. And that leads us to my second reason. The Jewish leaders were reporting that the disciples of Jesus had stolen the body. This is reported by Justin Martyr and Tertullian, corroborating, these are outside reports corroborating a similar report by Matthew. And it seems to be an attempt to account for a missing corpse. It was just like the 10-year-old who tells his teacher that the dog ate his homework. You wouldn't say this if you had it to turn in. And likewise, you wouldn't claim that the disciples of Jesus had stolen his body if it was still in the tomb. This information from unsympathetic reports is very powerful in eyes of historians. Paul Meyer, distinguished professor of ancient history at Western Michigan University, states the following: Jewish polemic shared with Christians the conviction that the sepulchre was empty, but gave natural explanations for it. And such positive evidence within a hostile source is the strongest kind of evidence. The third reason we can be confident about the empty tomb is because the claim of resurrection infers an empty tomb. What did I do there? Okay, it infers an empty tomb. The first Christians were Jews, and Jews held a variety of views regarding the afterlife. There were the Sadducees, who didn't believe in life after death. Rather, they held that when you died, that was it, no heaven. So they were sad, you see. Other Jews, like Josephus and Herod, held to a form of reincarnation. But the majority of Jews held that the body that dies is the same body that is raised and transformed into an immortal body. They called this resurrection. We see this in Isaiah, who writes, "Your dead will come back to life. Your corpses will rise up. Wake up and shout joyfully, you who live in the ground." Now, this is all important because it helps us understand what the early Christians meant when they claimed that Jesus had been resurrected. They meant that the body that dies is the same body that is raised and transformed into an immortal, glorious, and powerful body that will never break down. And so, of course, this infers an empty tomb when they're saying that Jesus was resurrected. And you see, if he wasn't resurrected, and yet they still saw him in some sort of a spiritual or ethereal, ghostly kind of state, they could have said that Jesus was somehow still alive, as Jesus himself had said, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were still living. But they would not have said resurrection, a term that referred to bringing the corpse back to life. So we discovered that there's good evidence for the empty tomb. The Jerusalem factor, it's witnessed by Jesus' enemies, and the claim of resurrection infers an empty tomb. The historical Jesus scholar Geza Vermesh, who rejects the resurrection, writes the following: "When every argument has been considered and weighed, the only conclusion acceptable to the historian must be that the women who set out to pay their last respects to Jesus found to their consternation not a body, but an empty tomb."
All right, so basically, Mike Liconia and William Lane Craig are basically arguing for the historicity of the empty tomb. Now, I agree with William Lane Craig and I agree with Mike Liconia that the empty tomb of Jesus is probably historical. I have no problems agreeing with that. William Lane Craig in another place, and Mike Liconia in another place, say that about 75% of New Testament scholars agree about the empty tomb story. They agree that the empty tomb story in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is historical. As for William Lane Craig saying that there was no spiritual resurrection in first century Judaism, that is false. N.T. Wright, a Christian scholar with no atheist bias, confirms a spiritual body exchange, losing a physical body and gaining a spiritual body. See N.T. Wright, The Resurrection of the Son of God, page 367. Other scholars who agree that spiritual resurrection, that there was a concept of a spiritual resurrection, losing a physical body and gaining a spiritual body in first century Judaism would be James Tabor, Bruce Chilton, Peter Lamp, Gregory Riley, Dale Barton, Andrea Collins, and C.F. Mole, some of these being Christian scholars. So basically the resurrection, according to the Jews, or according to first century Judaism, the group of Jews Jesus was, born into, they had different concepts of resurrection. Like the Sadducees didn't believe that there would be a resurrection. The Pharisees had a different concept of resurrection, etc., etc. So when Paul is writing about the resurrection, he's writing about a spiritual body in 1 Corinthians 15. he says that the body that is sown is not the body that will rise. Yet, where it's sown a physical body, it's raised a spiritual body. So that means there's an exchange of bodies. A physical body is exchanged for a spiritual body. So that's what Paul was talking about when he was talking about, his concept of the resurrection of Jesus. It was a spiritual body resurrection as opposed to a physical resurrection, an exchange of bodies as opposed to a transformation. But anyways, this whole concept of the empty tomb of Jesus proving the resurrection is false. The empty tomb of Jesus, despite being historical, does not prove the resurrection of Jesus. And there's a reason, and there's a couple reasons why. If you read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in the Gospel accounts, nobody sees Jesus getting resurrected. Nobody sees Jesus rising from the dead. Nobody sees Jesus in the tomb getting resurrected and walking out of the tomb. Nobody sees the resurrection of Jesus. The women and Peter only observe an empty body and are an empty body, they just observe, the empty tomb, and later they're visited. Also, the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, says that in Mark chapter 16, verse 9 to 20, is a later addition to Mark. It is not found in the earliest Greek manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark. So basically, if you know about New Testament scholarship, the earliest gospel written was the Gospel of Mark. So I have this archaeological study Bible right here, archaeological study Bible right here, and on page, if we go to the Gospel of Mark, hang on, let me pull it up real quick. It says on the Archaeological Study Bible, page 1662, the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have Mark chapter 16, verses 9 to 20. So basically, the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, does not have the resurrection story of Jesus. It ends in the Gospel of Mark chapter 15, the Gospel of Mark chapter 16, verse 8. It says, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So notice what it says. It says that the women went out and they ran away from the tomb. So basically the Gospel of Mark ends with the women going to the tomb and running out of the tomb and saying nothing to anybody. Later on, I think in the when was this written? Hang on. I believe it says in the footnote, it says the Gospel of Mark chapter 16 verses 9 to 20. Serious doubt exists as to whether these verses belong to the Gospel of Mark. They are absent from important early manuscripts and display certain perpendiculars of vocabulary, style, and theological content that are unlike the rest of Mark. See the ending of Mark page 1661. So hang on one second. So on page 1661 of this Bible, the Archaeological Study Bible, it talks about the ending of Mark, and it says that in the two oldest Greek manuscripts and a number of ancient versions, Mark's Gospel ends at Mark chapter 16, verse 8. So I'm trying to find when this verse was written. The earliest Greek manuscript with the ending of the Gospel of Mark chapter 16, verse 9 to 20, which is the resurrection story of Jesus, is from the 5th century, but evidence from the church fathers suggests that it was already in existence during the 2nd century. Many scholars feel, however, that the vocabulary and themes of traditional ending are inconsistent with the rest of the gospel. So, the ending of the gospel, Mark chapter 16, verse 9 to 20, the resurrection story, probably originated in the 2nd century or the 5th century. But anyways, it was added later on to the Greek manuscript of Mark. It was not in the original Greek manuscripts of Mark. So we see that in the Gospel of Mark did not have the resurrection story of Jesus. For example, in the Gospel of Mark uh, in the Gospel of Mark, it just ends with the women going to the tomb, right? So then somebody added a whole ending which talked about the resurrection of Jesus sometime in at the earliest 2nd century, at the latest at the 5th century. So it came way after the Gospel of Mark was written by some unknown author who tacked that ending in there for some reason. But anyways, if we read the other Gospels, we read Matthew, Luke, and John, the people who saw Jesus doubted it was Jesus. They didn't think it was the same physical Jesus before the crucifixion. For example, in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 28, verse 17, some people who saw Jesus while others doubted it was him. Jesus did not look like Jesus. So if you read the Gospel of Matthew chapter 28, verse 17, some people doubted that it was Jesus. It didn't look like a physical Jesus. The Gospel of Luke chapter 24, verse 16, some of the disciples didn't recognize Jesus. The Gospel of John chapter 20, verse 14, many people see Jesus and do not know it's him. So according to the Gospel of Matthew, Luke, and John, according to those verses I just cited, all this suggests that the disciples and the women were seeing a vision of Jesus after the empty tomb. They weren't seeing a physical, like, flesh and blood Jesus. They were seeing some kind of a vision of Jesus. If you read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or Matthew, Luke, and John, the whole so-called resurrection of Jesus is a very private event. Only a few people see Jesus after the empty tomb and after the crucifixion. So it was a very private occurrence. And the reason why is it fits more into the paradigm of, or it fits more into the reality of Jesus coming back as some kind of vision, some kind of subjective vision that the women like Mary Magdalene and the disciples like Peter, Thomas, etc., were seeing some kind of vision of Jesus, not like the physical version of Jesus. The Gospel of John, chapter 21, verse 4, Jesus appears to his disciples, but they don't know it's him. So why would the disciples not know what Jesus looked like, what he looked like? The reason why is because Jesus did not come back as a flesh and blood Jesus, that they knew before the crucifixion. He came back as a vision after the empty tomb and after the crucifixion of Jesus. So, and again, the Gospels are not entire histories, when it comes to learning about what happened to Jesus, after the crucifixion. For example, if you read the Gospel of Matthew chapter 27, verse 53, it says zombies descended to Jerusalem after the crucifixion, which shows that the Gospels are unreliable, that they're not reliable, that they're not telling reliable history about what happened to Jesus after the crucifixion. The Gospel of Matthew chapter 27, verse 53, zombies come out of Jerusalem. Does this sound like history? No, it sounds like something made up. And even Mike Liconia in another video said that, the Gospel of Matthew made up that story of zombies coming out of the tombs, and he got in trouble from the Christian university I think he was teaching at, when he said that this is just metaphorical or this is not historical, because it's a conservative Christian audience, or it was a conservative Christian school that he said it in, and he got in trouble for saying that. But I agree with him that that story is probably false, or it's made up, about zombies coming out of Jerusalem after the crucifixion of Jesus. That proves that even according to Christian scholars, or even according to Christian apologists like Michael Liconia, there are made up or false stories after the crucifixion of Jesus in the Gospels. But anyways, so what happened to Jesus? If you read the Q Gospel, there's a really good book called Daniel A. Smith, The Empty Tomb, where it talks about Jesus' disappearance or Jesus' assumption into heaven as opposed to his physical resurrection after the empty tomb. So Jesus was taken into heaven from the empty tomb, or Jesus was taken into heaven from the tomb, to God. It was an assumption, and it wasn't a resurrection. A resurrection is somebody rising from the dead, or somebody coming back to life after death. But when you read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, nobody sees the resurrected Jesus. Nobody sees the corpse of Jesus getting up and rising from the dead and walking out of the tomb. So nobody sees the resurrection of Jesus. So if you read the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, verse 39, and the Gospel of Luke, chapter 13, verse 35, Jesus says, "You will not see me until the end time." So according to the Q Gospel came before any of the New Testament writings, before Paul, before the Gospel, before Acts, before Revelations, etc., etc. According to the Q Gospel, Jesus was talking about his disappearance from earth, or his assumption into heaven, as opposed to, because if you read the Gospel of Q, it doesn't talk about the death of Jesus, and it doesn't talk about the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus was talking about his assumption or his disappearance from earth as opposed to his resurrection. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, verse 39, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 13, verse 35, and according to the Q Gospel, which is the earliest layer of the disappearance tradition, or the assumption tradition of Jesus, according to Daniel A. Smith in his book, The Empty Tomb. So I think that's what happened to Jesus. I think the strongest evidence against the resurrection is the Gospel of Mark, where the Gospel of Mark, the earliest Gospel, ended at Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 8. That shows that the earliest Gospel did not have the resurrection story of Jesus. Jesus coming to the women, or the women and the disciples finding the, so-called resurrected Jesus. If you read Matthew, Luke, and John, the story improves as time went on. For example, there's no doubting Thomas in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke. It's only found in the Gospel of John. So the story develops, and the fact that you have zombies in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 53, coming out of Jerusalem and walking around after the crucifixion, shows that whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew was making up the story of stories after the crucifixion of Jesus, about Jesus. So these aren't historical facts. These are just made up stuff. These are just made up myths after the crucifixion, because people didn't know what was happening. So I think this assumption of Jesus into heaven fits into what the Quran says about what happened to Jesus in the Quran chapter 3, verse 55, the Quran chapter 4, verse 157, and the Quran chapter 4, verse 158. The Quran is not denying Jesus' crucifixion. The Quran is not denying that Jesus was crucified. It's denying his death on the cross. And when the Quran says Allah raised him up to himself, Allah raised him from the tomb into heaven. So that's why that explains the empty tomb. It's a supernatural It's a supernatural event that God did to Jesus to protect him from his enemies, most likely the Jews and the Romans. So I think that explains the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157. Regardless, the empty tomb of Jesus does not prove his resurrection. It proves his assumption into heaven, or his translation, or his disappearance into heaven. It doesn't prove his resurrected physical self to the women and the disciples. Stay tuned. More videos are coming up, and stay tuned for the origins of the death and resurrection of Jesus, and who really made up the whole death and resurrection of Jesus. Stay tuned. More videos coming up ahead.